All right. We are live with the Ujamaa Hour. We are live with the Ujamaa Hour. This is Michael Tekin Strode. We're about to open up with a discussion around solidarity economies here on the Ujamaa Hour. And I will give you more feedback, more insight into exactly how that's going to go in a few moments. So we always like to go ahead and give ourselves pause for about 5 minutes so that we can make sure that the common thread catches up with the broadcast. So yes, this is myself, Michael Tekin Strode, on the Ujamaa Hour, and I will be giving you some introductions in a bit at the 5 minutes into the broadcast. All right, talk to you in a moment. Still here with that Ujamaa Hour. Again, we're just waiting 5 minutes into the broadcast. We always like to make sure that the audience common thread can catch up to the broadcast stream. So if you're in that chat section, feel free to go ahead and shout back with that Black Power salute, with that Black Cooperation salute. How all of the different ways that we are expressing ourselves within the BIBA group, the Bridge Embassy for Black America. Again, I want to give some introductions in a few moments, but we just want to give ourselves 5 minutes into the broadcast to make sure that we have everyone on board online touching base with us. If you have not shared the thread, make sure you share the video out. Let folks know that we are here. There's going to be some interesting discussion that's going to be going on here this evening with Professor Stacey Sutton of UIC. So we want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to engage in dialogue with what's about to happen in the space this evening. And if you know someone who needs to be introduced to these concepts, introduced to this discussion around cooperatives and cooperation, introduced to these discussions around other ways to think about economy, introduced to a discussion around other ways to think about how we are exchanging and engaging with capital in our communities, then this is the place to be. This is the Ujamaa Hour. And if you see that ticker in the bottom corner of the screen, we will be starting momentarily. Up, ticking down, 3 seconds to go, 2 seconds, and 1, and we are off. So again, this is the Ujamaa Hour, a place where we discuss cooperation and cooperative economics with a deeper lens. We are in this season of Kwanzaa. We are in this month of December where we will hear Ujamaa bandied about, to great accord as a part of one of those Kwanzaa principles. We'll hear this discussion around cooperative economics, and we'll talk about what it means to build our own stores and profit from them together. But what are the strategies that we are using in order to accomplish that goal? So the goal is to profit from them together. The goal is to build stores amongst ourselves within our communities. But what are the strategies that we are using to accomplish that? Are we using traditional entrepreneurship strategies? Are we using the same sort of market dynamics or market economies in order to accomplish those goals? and what are the ways that we are losing possibly we are diminishing some of our capacity or some of our ability to build successful operations and sustain successful businesses in our communities because we are again using as might be said, the master's tools, to deconstruct the master's house. So perhaps we could be using a different set of tools. Perhaps we could be using a different set of strategies. And here in the Ujamaa Hour, we want to unpack some of those strategies, which is something that we do here each month. Right now, we are here broadcasting on the second Monday of every month. So if you have not been here before, we will be back here every second Monday at 7:30. We do another one of these discussions. And before I begin and before I recap what we've done for the previous Monday discussions, I want to just make sure I give some introductions here. So down in the bottom right there, you do see the BIBA logo, the BIBA, the Bridge Embassy for Black America. If you do not have your Neo Green book, you still need it. The Bridge Embassy for Black America is a space where we build and protect Black. It's a space where we unpack some of these concepts around cooperative economics. We certainly, do the reporting back of our receipts inside of the group, but you also report your hours there. You report your time. You discuss the ways that you are actually reinvesting in your community, and only one of those capacities, as we discussed in the last month around capital, only one of the capacities that you have to invest inside of your community is financial. There are all these other ways, there are all these other strategies, there's all these other forms of capital that you could be investing in your community, from cultural capital, intellectual capital, experiential capital, political capital. What are all of the forms of capital that you could be reinvesting inside of your community that are not yet reported in BIBA that you probably should be reporting? Because ultimately, it's only when we actually discuss these things that we get to a conversation around what wealth looks like in our community. And certainly this was something that was discussed when I sat on a panel at the Public Newsroom with City Bureau. We were talking about that concept of generational wealth, and we were talking about how in Black communities, we were talking about what Black generational wealth looks like in Chicago. And one of the things that came up at the end of that discussion is that we don't have enough conversations around generational Black wealth. Now, the unfortunate thing is that since that time, we haven't had a large discussion around generational Black wealth in Chicago. And ultimately, I think that it's something that we could be talking about more. We could be giving people another set of tools to discuss those things. And perhaps we are missing an opportunity when we don't necessarily bring other people into those conversations or pull those conversations out of the spaces where they exist, because sometimes those spaces are limited. Sometimes those spaces are not necessarily accessible. So making information as accessible as possible so that we can get it to the populations that need to hear it. So we want to make sure that our entire community is represented in this space. And that's actually what we're going to be talking about with the Solidarity Economy this evening. But so yes, I talked about the previous Monday discussion. We talked about capital. Prior to that, the inaugural Ujamaa Hour, we talked about cooperation. And I'm losing the opportunity to use my images up here. So we talked about cooperation. So we see cooperation versus competition, or not even versus, but cooperation and competition, the two sides of two different strategies, to accomplish maybe not the same goals, but cooperation is what we discussed were strategies that human societies have traditionally used in order to accomplish mutually beneficial objectives or mutually beneficial aims. So we talked about that principle of cooperation, but then we talked about the actual tool of cooperatives as a way that we could structure our businesses so that we could create businesses that didn't necessarily have to be focused specifically on building our personal or our individual entrepreneurial capacity, but how do we combine the skill sets that we have inside of these business operations so that we can build businesses that draw upon, again, all of our experiential capital, the total sum of our experiential capital, and combine that into a single operation, into a single business, that then is able to thrive, in different ways than it would if we were specifically working from an entrepreneurial capacity and then trying to derive all of the value inside of the business from just, what we're able to muster or what we're able to purchase from other individuals, right? So cooperation and cooperatives was the subject of the first discussion. Capital was the subject of the second discussion, and we talked again, at length about those 8 forms of capital. So again, if you do not have your Neo Green book, pages 12 and 13 of the Neo Green book, those 8 forms of capital that we discussed: spiritual capital, natural capital, human capital, cultural capital, social, political, physical, and financial capital. So again, only one form of capital there is financial, but we have all of these other ways that we could potentially be exchanging and engaging in our community that we are losing, and we're missing the opportunity to build our spaces up, right? To reinvest in ourselves. And ultimately, when you begin to understand how all of these different forms of capital exist, then there's also a discussion to be had about how you transform between the different forms of capital, how you change from one form of capital to another. How does cultural capital become financial capital? How does natural capital become, built capital? It's a discussion that we need to understand and we need to have, because oftentimes we devalue some of the tremendous sources of capital that exist in our community because we're not looking at them as valuable assets, as valuable resources. And so if we have a deeper discussion around what capital looks like in our community, and we have a deeper discussion around what forms of capital we have available and accessible to us, then we can get away from this discussion around specifically calling communities under-resourced without having done the deeper work of understanding what the resources are that exist in a community. Just because a community doesn't have financial resources, there might be some other assets that might exist in that community that we could be tapping into, that we could be drawing down upon, that would be maximized through this discussion around cooperation, right? And this discussion around cooperatives. So one of the things that we are here to discuss tonight is going to be this subject of economy. So we've discussed cooperation, we've discussed capital, and now we want to dive into this discussion around economy. Now, oftentimes when we think about economy, perhaps, many of us think about economies like this, right? It's stocks and it's markets, and it's sort of globalized capital, and it's types of currency trading, right? Perhaps we think about economies like this because it's opaque, right? But a more basic definition of the economy might simply be this: what are the ways that we utilize our labor to engage with these forms of capital and create new capital? So, we talked about capital being forms of wealth that create other forms of wealth, right? Again, natural capital can transform into built capital or financial capital. Capital is always moving in these different ways. And so a really basic definition of the economy is the sum total of ways that we produce, consume, and distribute, resources that exist in our community. Different forms of capital, the ways that we move those forms of capital through our society, through our community, and recognizing that there's a quote that I often like to cite, at any event that I'm at, where we're talking about this discussion of wealth, which is from Movement Generation. And, one of the things that Movement Generation often talks about is that, or has that quote about, is that we don't need an expert to come in here and explain the economy to us. We live the economy every day. We live it in our families. We live it in our communities. We know what our needs are, and we know how we can best meet those needs, right? We are the ones that are most impacted by the situation. We know how to meet our needs. And so we know what strategies we need to employ to get at those problems. And so, that's something that I like to always introduce into this conversation around economy, because I want people to know that you don't need to be an expert to understand economy. And certainly, folks who are operating business enterprises, right? They understand the economics perhaps of their business, but, maybe they don't necessarily think about how their business interacts with the community. But in Biba we do, right? In Biba we're also always talking about the ways that, specific businesses interact with the community. And we're talking about how we can make sure that businesses in the Black community are accountable to members of their community. So we want to make sure that, if there's an issue with a business and a community member, that we're having some intervention that we're doing so that we can make sure that if that business is going to stay in that community and if that business is going to thrive, it needs to understand that it is not just a building or an establishment there. It is not just a place there that extracts wealth, but it is a place that is always in communication with the community. It's always exchanging and engaging with the community. It's part of the community economy. And being part of the community economy, it's accountable to the ways that it is influencing, either positively or negatively, the economy of that community. Yeah. And so, one of the things that I've been, looking at lately, and to the point of the question, right? So to the point of the question that was posed in one of the a post as I was sharing the event out or sharing the feed out to everyone was, what's the relationship between Julius Nyerere, Kate Raworth, and who did I say? Julius Nyerere, Kate Raworth, and my computer's going to go slow and it's not going to let me get at it for a few minutes. It's neither here nor there. We'll get at it in a moment. But Kate Raworth, has recently started, advancing this theory of donut economics, which is this idea that the ways that we think about an economy are best represented by this circular interaction, right? So this at the center of that donut, we see things like water, food, health, education, income and work, peace and justice, political voice, social equity, gender equality, housing, networks, energy, water, food. We see all of these basic things at the center of the economy. We see the space where where human beings exist inside of that economy. And then we see the things that exist on the outside of that donut, right? So if we recognize that specific resources or again specific forms of capital have specific boundaries, and that once we overstretch those boundaries, we certainly do get climate change, we do get ocean acidification, or we do get other sorts of things. We do get a lack of affordable housing in our community once we overshoot a certain set of boundaries around what resources are available and how we are best able to deploy those resources. So the relationship between specifically between Julius Nyerere and Kate Raworth is going to be and our guest this evening. See, look at that. I completely forgot, my post. Julius Nyerere, Kate Raworth, and Stacey Sutton. So all of these folks are people who have advanced the concept of solidarity economy in their life and in their work. I'll go back to Nyerere for a moment. So the very concept that we are speaking about inside of this hour, Ujamaa, we don't necessarily talk about this as often as we need to inside of the context of our Kwanzaa celebrations, but Nyerere advanced the concept of Ujamaa inside of Tanzania, in terms of trying to build a national development program, a national development initiative. So he was grounding his development in African socialism and thinking about this Ujamaa, or this sort of familyhood, as a way that he should structure the economy of the country so that the total development of the country could be advanced. Now, whether or not, we get to sort of 1985 and, all of the different factors that caused Ujamaa to not necessarily continue on inside of that country, we do know that literacy rate shot up. We do know that life expectancy shot up. We do know that the number of individuals who are enrolled in school shot up. So there were tremendous ways that Nyerere was thinking about solidarity economy inside of his development of Ujamaa, as he was trying to bring Tanzania out of this sort of colonial period. So in the colonial period, of course, there was a great lack of equity in terms of how resources moved around. But once we get to this period of Nyerere's term, we get to this point where we actually see that reinvesting in people, reinvesting in the larger society, reinvesting in the social fabric. So, there are elements of this inside of our city right now. Right now, we're in discussions in the city around how we invest in schools and whether or not we are investing enough in schools. We are in a discussion right now about whether or not we are investing in affordable housing inside of this city. And what we can also recognize is that if we look at the ways that these lacking investments impact other elements. So if you look at the fact that there's not necessarily affordable housing for the people who need it, and what does it mean when someone loses a house or does not have a house, right? What are the health implications of that? Or as they call it, the social factors of health. What are the health implications of not having adequate housing, of not having well-heated housing? What are the social factors of health that are impacting children who can learn if they don't have adequate nutrition? So one of the things the thing that we're looking at inside of this donut economy, that example that Kate Raworth is giving us, is there are all of these elements beneath what we consider the real economy. So we consider the real economy, businesses and markets and currencies that get exchanged between countries. That might be what we consider the real economy, but there are all these other factors that live beneath it. There are families that are supporting folks who are going out to build and labor inside of that real economy. There are elements of household production or elements of household work, home labor, that don't get respected if we don't have a broader definition of economy. There are elements of childcare arrangements. There are relationships between people inside of communities. So there are people who are cooperating with each other in communities to provide each other rides to the store or rides to pick up medication, that are providing, assistance with repairs at home or for elders, that are providing, things like, for yard work on a complementary basis. All of these are ways that people are in service of one another that don't necessarily show up in GDP. And what GDP measures is if I give you $1 and you give me a service, that's something that's measurable. But if I say, don't worry about it, you don't need to pay me today, you'll do me an ace tomorrow, you'll do me a favor later, we might be in solidarity with each other, but that's not considered a valuable economic transaction for the purposes of determining the greater sort of value of nations, right? And so solidarity economy is this idea that there are all of these limitations to the ways that we think about economy, and that we are engaging in economic development, and that if we can shift our orientation towards things like cooperatives, towards things like cooperation, towards a different view of those 8 forms of capital, then it's possible that we could reinvigorate the development in our community. So one of the discussions that we had in the last segment, previous Monday, the previous second Monday segment, was around this idea of big box retail, and around this idea that big box retail is not loyal, right? And around the notion that, if when Target pulls out of that 85th Street location, what does that mean for that space, and what does that mean for that community? And what is it that we are actually seeking to put back in that space? How are we thinking about investing in that space, that space that's going to go vacant at this point? If we go back to the same model, and one of the examples that I may have given in the previous segment was about North Lawndale Community Coordinating Council and their recent comprehensive community plan. One of the elements that they mentioned in their comprehensive community plan was that they wanted to attract the big box retailer. Is that the best strategy for investment? Is that the most sustainable strategy? That's the bigger question. Because ultimately, any big box retailer that you draw into your community is accountable not necessarily to that community directly, because again, we don't have a community benefits ordinance, sidebar, but they're accountable to their shareholders, and ultimately their shareholders and their investors put a certain amount of money into the company. They want a certain return on their investment. And is that the best way to think about structuring our economic development? Is that the thing that's going to give us the best return? So that's that example of donut economy. And the sort of other element that I wanted to kind of point to this evening, just in terms of our model. So, we always try to have a model on this show, right? We had the Federation of Southern Cooperatives to kind of helm our discussion around capital. And so around this discussion of solidarity economies and around structuring our economies in ways that really fuel sustainable development, the model that we'll go ahead and highlight, is going to be Cooperation Jackson. So it's an ambitious plan. It's a plan that is meant to take the city of Jackson, which, historically, so way back comes from an agrarian economy, but then shifts into this other space where, it's trying to compete in this larger industrial economy, although absent, much industry. And so what are the ways that we start to see inequity develop in a city like that? So we see it, and it's the same sort of inequity that, you might see in Chicago or St. Louis. In Chicago, the west and south sides, generally miss all the dollars, and TIF goes to Lincoln Yards. In St. Louis, the Del Mar Loop is popping. But, if you're not on the Del Mar Loop, you probably ain't got nothing much going for you, right? So this is the sort of ways that Cooperation Jackson is thinking about how do we structure a city around these notions that we can build a solidarity economy here, and this is what is necessary to move the largest amount of people in a city forward. To get everyone further, to get everyone ahead, we need structures that think about community ownership, social ownership. So the greatest number of workers that, we can kind of get, owning a company, ensures that the profits that accrue to the company are then simply distributed and divvied up amongst those workers, that the ownership stake that those workers have in the company, gives them a certain set of benefits that they will accrue inside of the organization. And then they can also have a greater structure of governance around how the company is run. So, when the company does turn a profit, they can make a decision to distribute it amongst themselves, or they can make a decision to reinvest it. They can make a decision around what type of benefit structure is needed to serve the workers in that company best. And then they'll have a discussion about it. And then they'll have a vote about it. So Cooperation Jackson is thinking about how this structure works when you start to combine elements like we talked about with cooperatives, when you start to combine cooperatives with community land trust. So we've talked about this element of cooperatives for the purposes of workforce development and employment. We're talking about community land trust for the purposes of maintaining housing affordability. You start to combine that, with government policies that actually reinvest in or leverage those sort of policies in order to reinvest in those land trusts and in those cooperatives. And you start to think about all of the other ways that we might cooperate to create a better space for the largest number of citizens in an area. And Cooperation Jackson is doing that with its community production initiatives, and it's in other works that they are attempting to develop there, modeling on elements that are happening in Puebla, modeling on elements that are happening in Mondragon, and modeling on elements that are happening in Cleveland. So ultimately, again, how do we build social ownership into the greatest number of factors or spaces inside of a city? So again, social ownership in housing looks like we talked about community land trust, limited equity cooperatives or housing cooperatives that allow us to kind of, pool our living expenses. What are all of these collaborative ways that we can be developing and cultivating the economy in our community in solidarity with one another? The principles of a solidarity economy: solidarity, cooperation, mutualism, equity in all dimensions. So looking from a race equity lens, when we look at development, how does it actually impact the members of that community from a perspective of displacement? When we talk about the Obama Library, from an element of affordability and long-term residency, solidarity, cooperation, mutualism, equity in all dimensions, participatory democracy. What does participatory budgeting look like, and why do we need it in every ward in Chicago? Sustainability. So we talked about big box retail and the lack of sustainability there. And then pluralism. There are lots of different solutions that we could move after. Give us a broad set of solutions and don't simply stick with one because that's the one we know. So pluralism, what's the broad solution set that we are after? And how does that solution fit the goal? So if the goal is to provide, the greatest affordability for food to the greatest number of citizens in this city, is the best way to do that to attract a big box, food retailer or a large grocer? Are they actually going to stick around? Or are they going to do a Treasure Island on 55th and Lake Park? Or are they going to do a Dominic's on 71st and Jeffrey? If we're trying to ensure both affordability and sustainability, what's the best strategy for that? What's the best solution? So my guest this evening is going to be Professor Stacey Sutton from UIC, the College of Urban Planning and Policy Administration. She is a specialist in these solidarity economies, as well as, in other subjects around gentrification, around cooperative city initiatives. And I think that she has a great deal to share with us. And so, I'd like to welcome my guest, Stacey Sutton. Stacey, I got you here now.
Hey.
Oh,
are we on now?
Let me unmute you. I'm sorry, I got this speaker. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you. This is great. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and participate in BBA.
Excellent. So why don't you just maybe give us a bit of an overview of your work, thus far, your work and your research.
So as Michael said, I'm a professor of urban planning, but my specialization is community economic development, neighborhood change, and kind of racial inequality and how that plays out in space. So I do a lot of work with small businesses, but I've more recently I've been looking at, cooperative arrangements, whether it's a cooperative business or cooperative kind of engagement of community residents in participatory processes like a community benefit agreements or community planning. At the end of the day, I'm really interested in equitable development and equitable kind of ownership, proprietorship of our communities, and particularly of Black communities. And so that's where my research focuses. As you mentioned, I also look at gentrification. It's you kind of have to look at gentrification if you're interested in our neighborhoods because of what's happening in so many of our neighborhoods as they change. And that's not a passive change. It's, these are spaces that we made the best of because we're relegated to those spaces often as wealth and kind of whiteness moved out to the suburbs. We stayed behind in the city because that was the only place we were allowed to stay. We were also burdened with the high cost of real estate disproportionate to what white folks were paying. So over the years, as you know, we've been in these cities and we've braved the lean years. And now the city is an attractive location. And that's happening across the country as people get tired of commuting long distances, as firms move back to the city. Higher income folks want to move back to the city as well. And so where do they go? They go to the neighborhoods that we've stabilized. And that's what's creating this gentrification. That's part of it. There are other things that are creating it. So I look at those dynamics as well.
Absolutely. And so when you're speaking about this notion of economy, how do you frame economy so that it's most broadly understood by the by most people?
So when I talk about economy, it's one of these terms that we think we know what it is because it comes up so often, and yet it's difficult to define in some ways. And so I tend to think of it as a kind of a system for distributing and exchanging resources. And there are a myriad of resource types, right? It's not just financial capital. It's all sorts of resources. And it's the way in which we as a society deal with the challenge of provisioning for ourselves, or, so how do we provide the goods and services that we need to sustain? And so an economy is anything that we construct to do that.
Absolutely. And so then why would a solidarity economy be a beneficial structure for us to examine in this current time?
Yeah. So, I teach this graduate course on the solidarity economy, and I tend to begin by getting the students to think about the way in which we talk about economy generally. And generally, we talk about economy as this scarcity, as a framework that's based on scarcity and a framework that's based on competition. And when you have scarcity, there's a general fear that you have to try to accumulate as much as you can before someone else does, because there's only limited amounts, right? But we know that there's plenty to go around. We know that there's not really a scarcity, that we could all do well, and we could help each other do well if we learn to trust each other and to cooperate. And so when I talk about the solidarity economy, and I work on solidarity economy, I kind of frame that as in two ways. One, a way of kind of rebutting this notion of scarcity, because we both have resources and we have capacity to leverage those resources to produce what we need. We know what we need, and we have the resources collectively to create that, right? And that's assuming we don't kind of fall victim to the scarcity model, because as soon as you do that, you start hoarding. You start thinking about, well, what's best for me as an individual, rather than being open to the possibility of collectivism. So that's fundamental to solidarity, because we can't have solidarity if we don't trust that someone else we won't have others if we don't trust that they have us, right? So that's one. The other side of that is kind of thinking about the solidarity economy and the way in which it's been articulated globally. And so this is not just a movement within the United States, and perhaps even less in the United States than elsewhere, like in Latin America, in parts of Africa, and so forth. So this has been around for quite some time, and so people talk about it as a global movement. It's rooted in the values, many of the values that you've already articulated, and they're a set of practices, everything from building the individual capacity to coming up with collective solutions to issues, and it also addresses the failures, like market failures, things in which, the market, by definition, capitalism creates inequality, right? That's the only way that it can function. And so while we work in a market economy, the market will inevitably fail some folks as others benefit. So a solidarity economy is one that is rooted in values, understands these relationships, it strives for kind of an equitable, egalitarian, and sustainable kind of infrastructure, rather than something that's extractive and atomizing or individualizing, And so when you think about that, while those are some kind of big words in the sense of, like, what do they mean? If we unpack each one of those, we then can think about projects that really start to advance those things, right? So when we talk about equitable, we then look from a planning perspective. I think about projects that create equitable outcomes, but they also allow for equitable inputs. They allow for participatory processes so that we can articulate what we need and be at the table and hopefully create these equitable outcomes. An example might be community benefit agreements, although that's not the cure to the ills that we're facing, but that is at least something that moves toward a more equitable distribution of some resources, right? Mm-hmm. We have to think about things that are sustainable. Well, what does that mean? It's everything from sustainable infrastructures and sustainable materials to sustainable economies. Like, we live in places and we have needs, and we need resources and we need products and services. Well, how do we support the businesses that are supporting us? Whether they're organized as cooperatives or not, if we really want a sustainable community and a community infrastructure, we have to participate in a way in which we're helping to sustain it, right? So again, I take all of the elements of the solidarity economy as it gets defined, and then try to think about how that plays out in our lived experiences, in our planning practices, and then I organize projects around that for students.
And so, in terms of the relationship that you have between your thoughts about solidarity economy and urban planning in Chicago, tell me something about sort of the equity inside of the urban planning process in Chicago, and maybe your critiques on that.
Ooh, that's going to be simple. So I don't think Chicago has the best equity framework, let's just say. And so planning is a funny discipline. As a scholar of planning, most of what I think about, I critique planning. Planning is part of the problem in terms of it's been complicit in the structuring of cities as unequal spaces, as part of it's been at the table when the decisions about redlining and segregation and even the Fair Housing Act was passed in '68, but woefully limited. Planners were at the table. And so to be an urban planning scholar is to be able to recognize the problems of this seemingly benign discipline. People don't really know what it is, but it operates in the background in sometimes the most pernicious ways. Knowing that, it then allows you to think about, well, okay, so I have students that want to go into this profession. They don't fully know the history of it. One, you inform, that history, and then you think about within Chicago, what does that mean? When we look at the landscape of Chicago and this deep, deep, deep historical and contemporary segregation across the city, well, what were the policies and practices and representations that have created that and sustained that, right? And, we can talk about so many of them, but it's really, for me, it's about teaching the students that these things are intentional. These are not just natural processes by which people just organize themselves. People are responding to conditions. They're responding to policies. They're responding to a set of practices that marginalize Blackness historically and contemporarily, right? So people are doing the best they can within these limits and constructs, right? So then that plays out in space, and it plays out across Chicago, and that's why we can speak of the north side, the south side, and the west side, and we know the racial terminology that goes around with that. You can just say you're from the south side, and we know what that means, right? So in terms of, back to your question in terms of equity, Chicago is, but it's not alone, but it really is primitive, quite honestly, in terms of conversations around equity within the city. But there's another part of this city, like within the municipality. But the grassroots movements are extra powerful, right? In the sense that when I look at other cities, some cities have rhetoric around equity, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. There's always inequality. Blackness is always on the bottom. But nevertheless, there's some kind of positions within city government that allows for more equitable distribution of resources. Chicago, they don't purport to, right? That it's not even part of the rhetoric. But what that means is that we've had so much time to really build up the grassroots movements in Chicago, whether we're talking about education and the fierceness around education. We have a history of labor movements in Chicago. We have, and now the cooperative movement is, again, it might not be as advanced as some other cities, but nevertheless, it's fermenting in Chicago, and it's growing in Chicago. And I think once it takes off a little bit more, it's going to align very nicely with the culture of of resistance that is part of the infrastructure of Chicago. So I have no doubt that it's going to just grow as fast as it has in some of the other cities. So that question of equity, it's hard to point to because I don't have examples. I can't point to examples in Chicago where I say, oh yeah, this is an equitable redevelopment project or an equitable distribution of resources. We
Okay.
can't point to any.
So then, in Biba, we like to kind of talk about the distinctions between what, these sort of they are doing, I mean, in terms of the overriding structures and governance. But then there's the what are we doing, so what
Yeah.
are our best responses? So what are the best responses of, Black communities who may be faced with disinvestment or gentrification? What are some ways that we can kind of think about using solidarity economy to respond to that? What are some maybe examples that we should be drawing upon and pulling into our cities to respond to some of these?
Yeah, I mean, and I do think there are a number of those. So, although the Obama Center, that community benefit agreement, although they didn't sign on, I think it's opened up the conversation around CBAs generally, both as agreements and as ordinances. And so I think people are thinking more critically about what that means in terms of any kind of development that comes to their neighborhood, and should we pass ordinances. Other things that are happening within the city, I think in different neighborhoods like North Lawndale, in Austin, both of those communities are, like Austin is working on this food cooperative that is not just a healthy food cooperative, although it will have more healthy food. It's addressing the dearth of accessible food within the neighborhood. So it will be a supermarket, but cooperatively owned, and they're open to the idea of it being a worker-owned cooperative, right? So I'm part of a conversation and an advisory committee that's working on that. In North Lawndale, there's some different community organizations that are doing social enterprise. And so actually next semester, I hope to work with one of those organizations in terms of like maybe a feasibility study as they're trying to expand. I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's the organization that works with the honey, with the bees and the honey.
Sweet Beginnings, I think.
Yes, thank you. I think that's it. Yeah. So I'm going to try to help them kind of build out their work a bit. Shirley, I mean, all the work that you've been doing here on the South Side in Colonut and bringing people together, right? That's sustained, like every other Sunday, rain or shine, you're holding space for folks to talk about cooperative engagement, to talk about cooperative economics, to talk about, collectivism. And we know from other cities like Philadelphia that doing that over time creates opportunities. It creates relationships, which is really important. It creates bonds of trust, which is central to solidarity. And then that will then create opportunities for developing kind of an enterprise together. Other things, I think, big Black in Green. They're looking at Woodlawn from the sustainable green, from a green lens, a green perspective, and looking at a sustainable economy, and trying to come up with a pilot program that works in Woodlawn. Thus, the idea that thus it will work in other neighborhoods. But I think they too have been relentless in they continue to show up and really engage neighborhood residents around redevelopment on our terms, on their own terms, green infrastructure and what that looks like and so forth. I'm trying to think of other projects. I mean, so of course the cooperative, the ecosystem that we're trying to establish in Chicago, or it's been established, but we're now kind of building it out and building the capacity, because a lot of things are happening in Chicago. I think the challenge is that we're not as integrated as we could be, right? And so how do we put in place systems so that we know who's doing what, so we can actually leverage each other's capacities? And so that I think is really promising as an initiative that's happening in Chicago.
Absolutely. And so in terms of, the Cooperative Ecosystem Coalition. If you just want to maybe give a bit more background to folks on that, we haven't sort of done a broad introduction, but just maybe talk about what it is that the goal of the coalition is.
Okay, yeah. So within the worker owned cooperative kind of movement, there's been conversation and some literature that's been produced that in order for these enterprises to develop and sustain, there needs to be a whole kind of infrastructure, an ecosystem that includes technical assistance, it includes the incubators, it includes champions perhaps in city government, it includes funders and financiers and so forth, right? There's a whole set of folks that are outside of the worker-owned cooperative but are necessary to support worker-owned cooperatives. Once you realize that, you have to then look at your city and say, oh, do we have these things locally? Sometimes you can get some of that technical assistance nationally, these national organizations, but you really want to have as much of it locally. And so in Chicago, we realized that there existing, over the summer we realized that there's some of these the elements of a healthy ecosystem exists, and there's some gaps. So a few of us came together to kind of think through what would it mean to build this coalition out, bring together the elements of the ecosystem that exist, and really try to think through what elements aren't as strong in Chicago. What are the needs of worker-owned cooperatives in Chicago? What types of worker cooperatives currently exist? What else might emerge? And can we bring each other? Can we kind of bring the various elements in conversation with each other? So we established the Chicago Cooperative Ecosystem Coalition with the hope that it would be a space for those conversations and for getting and building relationships, so that we can further expand the worker cooperatives in Chicago. And that includes both new businesses, supporting those that exist, starting new worker cooperatives, and perhaps supporting the conversion of businesses that are traditionally structured to a worker-owned structure.
Okay, excellent. So in terms of people locating their sort of everyday capacity to plug into what solidarity economy looks like, what would you advise in terms of perhaps there are ways that it already exists, perhaps there are other ways that they can kind of expand their practice and their view of thinking about solidarity economy? What would you advise in terms of people just really kind of digging further into that study?
Well, it depends. So it really depends where you're beginning. Some of it is actually beginning with reading some information about what the solidarity economy is, but it's also just showing up for events. Because the solidarity economy is not one thing. It is a lot of different elements, right? And plugging in is really about showing up for something, right? And bringing your resources to bear on whatever's happening or whatever you're working on, inviting others in. So if you're interested in kind of neighborhood dynamics and neighborhood change, perhaps it's getting involved in a community, some kind of community participatory budgeting or a community benefits agreement, or a local cooperative initiative. I mean, it really depends. But it's typically starting fairly locally where you are, and coming out and trying to figure out, well, how can you contribute? It's hard to say what the initiative is. That's what I mean. I'm meaning that all the things I just mentioned all fall within the solidarity economy. The participatory budgeting, community benefits agreements, community land trusts. That's another big area that I think we need to move in Chicago. Other cities have done quite a bit with community land trusts, but essentially it's we have a lot of vacancy in Chicago, so that vacancy shouldn't go to the aldermen. They shouldn't have full power over those lots. That might be the first stop. But those lots need to be put into a trust that is a community-owned trust, not a city-run trust, but a community organization that is entrusted with maintaining the land value, keeping the land value affordable, essentially. So people can build on that land, but those who live in the properties that are built on that land, they're then leasing the land back from to the trust, right? And so essentially, if you decide to sell your property on that land, you cannot sell it at an exorbitant rate because the community essentially owns that. That allows for affordable housing, to build affordable housing and sustain affordable housing in communities. So all of that is part of the solidarity economy.
Okay. Yes, I've been in pummeling a bit, at some mayoral candidates and, aldermanic candidates, just to kind of think about this notion that, the Chicago Community Land Trust has been in existence 12 years and they've turned over 70 affordable units. In that period
Yeah.
of time, so they're not even trying, I mean, that's
And
not
the
even
thing is, Chicago is the only city in the country in which the mayor has some power over the land trust. In other cities, there are multiple land trusts, and they're organized neighborhood by neighborhood. It's
yes,
not a city. The thing is, the mayors of Chicago have their hands in way too much,
absolutely.
and then it's no longer a community. How is that a community land trust when it's centralized at the mayor's office?
Yes.
It has to be a neighborhood, and I don't think people even realize that's how they're supposed to be. That's historically how they were organized, and that's how in every other city except Chicago, that's how they're structured. But
Yes.
Chicago, it's a central thing that it just doesn't. It's not. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Okay, and since we're in this electoral cycle, I just participated in the Chicago United for Equity, or Chicago United for Equity. They had the vote equity submissions. Effectively they're building out a ballot, that's sort of equity focused. But essentially, I just kind of was using it to kind of pitch, all these solidarity economy questions that I think should be on somebody's ballot. So
Yeah.
if there was a way that, you could introduce the solidarity economy into either a mayoral forum or a mayoral discussion, I know that I was focusing on, zoning advisory councils and community driven zoning and development, as well as participatory budgeting. And I think I also kind of pitched something about community councils, taking power from aldermen, so they're
Mm-hmm.
more
Correct.
prerogative. But so what's your sort of big pitch, in
I
terms?
guess I would say community land trusts, support for worker-owned cooperatives.
Mhm.
Um, I would agree with you in terms of community councils, absolutely, or anything that kind of minimizes some of the power of the aldermanic power. Um, but I think if I had to pick two or three, I would say community land trusts and worker-owned cooperatives.
Okay, excellent. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and open the floor for questions. If there are questions that you all have for Professor Stacey Sutton, please go ahead and post those in the comment section. We'll be monitoring them for a few moments so that we can make sure that they get answered. And we know that the live stream has a bit of a lag time. So yes, if there are comments or questions that you want to have for Professor Stacey Sutton, please go ahead and post those in the comments section there. All right, and already here I see we've got Brian Hudson. Good to see you, Brian. We've got Lotus Love, Mama Sophia Rashid. All right, I see quite a few new faces in here. Mark Quinn, Will Green, Robin Anderson, and Erica. Hey, folks, glad. Thank you all for joining the Ujamaa Hour this evening. We really appreciate your viewing with us. And if there are questions, please go ahead and post them. Are there regular meetups? So, I was going to get to that, but I'll go ahead and make a pitch for that now. So yes, Mama Sophia, asking about those regular meetups. Mama Sophia was indeed at one of the meetups. Whoop, I didn't want to do that one yet. Boom. So if you are not already plugged into Cooperation for Liberation, you've got the logo there on the screen, and also in my camera here, you see the zine. If you have not gotten a copy of the co-op zine, it means you were not at the forum. Oh, darn. We had a fabulous co-op forum where we had some conversations around the books that we've read thus far, Collective Courage and Jackson Rising. We're talking right now around what text we're going to be reading towards the future. Cooperation for Liberation is a biweekly study and working group that we host currently at the Breathing Room space, 1434 West 51st Street And the next session is going to be this Sunday, December 16th at from 3 to 5 p.m. So, if you are available, come on out to Cooperation for Liberation. Again, we do it every other Sunday. We're trying to make sure that we're stimulating conversation around cooperatives in the Black community as a model, as a strategy. We're looking at models that existed in the past, and one of the things around the forum that was posted in the Biba group was that cooperative gallery. So, we've got a long trajectory of Black folks doing cooperation and doing cooperatives, and we should draw upon those models, look at them, ask questions about them, right? We don't necessarily want to look at them without a critical lens, but just, look at what they were, how they were structured, and then figure out what we're going to do now, so that's the ultimate goal. So yes, every other Sunday, and this Sunday is the next session at the Breathing Room Space, 1434 West 51st Street. That will be posted in Biba, so you will get to see that again. All right, let me see if there are other questions in the forum. So yes, Mama Sophia had the regular meetup question. Brian Hudson, are you involved with planning in the Black community? And if so, do they have a shared view of tonight's discussion? I need some more context possibly on that second question. But yeah, Brian Hudson's question is, are you involved with planning in the Black community? And Brian, I should note, is involved with some developments in Inglewood. I think he's part of, he is part of the Inglewood, I'm forgetting now, the E.G. Wood. Yeah, so he's part of the E.G. Wood collaborative there in Inglewood. He does Beehive Consulting, I want to say. Correct me if I'm wrong about that business name, Brian. But yeah, so Brian is active in the architectural world.
Okay. So I just wanted for clarification, do you mean planning in the Black community, the organization that's part of the American Planning Association? Is that what he's referring to? Or does he mean planning in the Black community just generally?
Let's see if Brian has answered either of those questions. Brian, so if you are, if you can go ahead and clarify both of those questions.
I mean, I can answer even if he doesn't. So
okay.
the APA, Planning in the Black Community, the organization, is mostly students.
Okay.
The one that I know of, it's a national organization that is mostly students, but not only. The issue for me is that I was somewhat critical of planning as a discipline. I'm not very active in the discipline, the professional discipline, right? So there's that. So if that's what he means, no, not so much. I think when they first established Jeffrey Lowe's brother in Texas, I was kind of part of those conversations, but I'm just not part of the professional practice in that way. But in terms of actual work in our communities, absolutely.
Okay, and he did post that he was talking about the APA arm as well. Yeah. All right. And yeah, I think so. Then that second question maybe makes further sense now. If so, do they have a shared view of tonight's discussion? No,
I wouldn't think so. Quite honestly, but I don't know because I haven't been part of the conversations in a few years. But it's a fairly quote unquote liberal group, not very progressive and it reflects planning. It's more progressive than the planning discipline overall, but it's still, in my view, quite limited. So, but I don't discourage you from, if you're interested, to check it out to see if perhaps their views have evolved. But that wasn't part of the conversation a few years ago.
Okay, all right. And he expressed an interest in speaking offline. So
okay.
We'll make sure that you are connected with Brian Hudson. Were there other questions for the discussion? So any questions for Professor Stacey Sutton? Any questions around the solidarity economy, either abroad or in Chicago? And ultimately, any questions around the ways that we can be thinking about Ujamaa in a much deeper way for this particular month, but just overall, in general. So making sure that, again, we are bringing the area into the conversation. We are recognizing that, the development plan that he had for Tanzania was something that, we should look at critically, ultimately because we are talking about doing community development and doing community development plans and been participating in that process in Chicago here in our neighborhoods. So if there are no further questions, I'm just going to double check.
Okay.
Let's see. All right. So yeah, if there are no further questions, I'm going to go ahead and close out with Professor Stacey Sutton. I really,
Okay.
really appreciate the conversation this evening. It's been enlightening. I went off on a tangent there, and sort of, did the urban planning nerd thing, so it's great. I hope everyone could, follow that tangent with me. I really appreciate that. And yeah, so I'm really delighted that you came on this evening and, look forward to much more work here in the solidarity economy in Chicago.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for doing this work, Mike.
All right.
All
Thank you
right.
very much. You have a
Take
good
care.
evening now.
You too.
All right, folks. So that is the conclusion of this edition of the Ujamaa Hour. The Ujamaa Hour, where we do think deeply around cooperative economics. So, again, we've covered some thorough topics here this evening. We talked about, the basics of an economy. We've talked about, the ways that we think about economy in the sort of macro sense. We've talked about some of the micro elements of the economy. And ultimately, we decided that we've kind of dug into the ways that the economy shows up inside of our communities and inside of our neighborhoods. And I hope that it was useful to you. I hope that it was valuable to you. And I look forward to seeing you all on the next edition of the Ujamaa Hour. All right. Good evening, folks.